This name, Aldine, needs explaining. It's types that are modelled on or certainly influenced by those of Aldus Manutius, the printer in Venice, whose work we've looked at. We'll look at some examples as we go through this particular lecture. It's a complicated story which on the whole became simpler in the 1950s as a result of the work of mainly the people named here. Henrik Vervliet, who was the deputy curator at the time of the Planten Museum in Antwerp, went with essentially three people. Harry Carter, the scholar whose work was published in 1969 in his View of Early Typography. Matthew, his son, who is a professional type designer who learned punch cutting at this period, and it clearly influenced his whole life. And then finally Mike Parker, another young person. Matthew was still at school at this time. Mike was a student at Yale University who'd intended to go into architecture, but this experience again directed him towards typography. He became type director at the Linotype company in the United States. Vervliet published, two books that I'm going to show you here. The most easily obtainable is this book on French Renaissance printing types, the ones we're going to look at, which is available and not very expensive. We'll look at that in a moment. Paleotypography just means old types, and it's a collection of his own essays. And finally, the Lebay Memorandum. Well, that is a manuscript which has survived. It was written by a member of the Lebay family, who were type founders, and we'll look at a few examples of it. One essay I'm not going to make much of, but you'll find it quoted everywhere, is this one. Paul Beaujon didn't exist. He was the pen name of Beatrice Ward, who was a kind of protégé of Stanley Morrison, and it's pretty certain that she used quite a lot of his own researches in writing this essay. It has its importance, and I'll come back to it rather later in this series, but for the moment, if you can't find it, and that's almost certainly the case, don't worry. It's not necessary. This is the one I do advise. It, as I say, was written by Vervliet quite late in his career, and its great advantage is that, for example, if we look at the types that he lists, he can often show them cast from original matrices. So here is a type by Robert Grandjean, and it's new type, made in time for that printing of 2010. As for the punch cutters themselves, there was an extraordinary range of expert punch cutters. This is not all of them, but I'm going to concentrate on just a few of these. Augereau died early because he got involved in some of the more aggressive religious controversies of his time. So he was in fact executed. His importance to us is that it seems that Claude Garamond was apprenticed to him, and I suppose carried on his work. Simon de Colline, well, we'll look at him, and perhaps two others or three others that I'm naming here. Robert Grandjean, well, we'll certainly come back to him, perhaps as a single lecture in its own right. Guillaume Le Bay. They were a kind of dynasty. I said they were type founders. In fact, this Le Bay certainly made his own type. But importantly, from our point of view, he actually bought a lot of Garamond's materials at his death in 1561. And the family kept it and indeed provided type from it. Lastly, Constantin, we'll come back to him. If the Le Bay type foundry kept the material of Garamond going, this is important to us because they could go on casting from original matrices. The third type down here, Gros Canon by Garamond, we'll be having a look at that, which, as you see, had 140 punches. Well, the punches have disappeared, but original matrices for it do still exist in Antwerp, sold by the Le Bay family to Plantin. As for the type that was in use in France in the early 16th century, here's some that I've shown before, a Gothic type, which was quite normal, a Bâtard Gothic. Very fine piece of type making. And we're in the 1520s here. It would be displaced by the new generation of Romans we're going to look at. And here's the work of Aldus Manutius, the Aldine type, as used in this book by Bembo on Etna, 1496, which is clearly a very small book, but somehow it got known and became a model, as I shall show you. Here's the Aldine letter, cut, we are pretty sure, by a man called Griffo, Francesco Griffo, and it looks very normal to us, because in a way it gave a kind of model to many, many later types that are still in use. Two features to notice now, and we'll come back to them. Letter E in other types made in Venice had a kind of sloping bar to it. In this type of Aldus, it's gone horizontal, and that would be one feature to watch out for. Two other spot letters we'll come back to. M, capital M, has no right-hand serif, or hardly any. Nor does G. Both of those are the so-called spot letters we'll see cropping up in the work of French punch cutters. Here is the work of Augereau, the man who taught Garamond in 1531. It's an interesting text because Navagero, whose work in Latin is shown here, was in fact the ambassador of Venice, of the Venetian Republic, to the French monarchy. He'd also done some work for Aldous. So there's a connection which is worth making a note of. There's an enlargement of the type used in this work. And here you can see the horizontal E. And indeed, if you look at the capital M at the top, no right-hand serif. So put the two together, and they really are very close indeed. Griffo on the right, Augereau we've just been looking at. One other letter I might add here, the lowercase s. Some of the other Venetian printers had quite a broad lowercase s. This one is narrow, if you look at the Griffo line. Not only narrow, but slightly tilted over. A little bit like the capital letter in some Roman inscriptions. Then look at Augereau. There it is. Well, we'll see more bits of it when we look at a bit of the some of the other types of this period. Just to remind you what Jensen looked like, this is not Jensen, but it is someone imitating his type pretty closely. A piece of printing in Switzerland, in Basel, but it has the slope bar to the E, it has that relatively wide lowercase s, and so on. So here is the model that was being challenged by the new types. A major family among printers at this date, around about 1530, is that of the Estiennes, and this is an edition of the works of Virgil, and we'll look at the imprint here. First of all, the question of who actually made this type. We've gone now to the Lebet Memorandum, this note of type history written by a member of the Lebet family, who said that Aldous refined letters and made a Roman to replace the Gothic. And Lebet says it was imitated, the style, by Augereau, also by two people, Constantin and Simon de Colline. So who was Constantin? We don't know. But if we go back to that Virgil, who was it who was doing these Aldine letters in the first years of the 1530s? Colline to some extent, but much more convincingly, whoever did this type here. Constantin, since we don't know what he did, and he was clearly worth mentioning, Vervliet made the suggestion this is the work of this hardly known character, because we'll see it, this model cropping up in the work of one Claude Garamond. And it's often been said that this must be the work of Garamond. Now, no one, I think, now seriously believes this. We don't know exactly when Garamond was born, but he can only have been just starting out in the trade. Whoever did this type, and the other types in this book, knew very well what he was doing. Here, for example, is the text of this Virgil, a 13-point. It's an Aldine type. It's certainly based on the work of Griffo, and you've only got to look at the M and G in the second line above to see how closely he was picking up certain letters of Griffo. The line in the smaller size above, by the way, is a Jensen style with its sloping E. But if we look at a page of the Etienne Virgil, 1532, we'll see that there is that big type, which is round about a 40 point, which is picking up these two key letters, the M without a top right-hand serif, and the G, which is much the same. Well, there we are. Simon de Colline. He got very involved in the Estienne family. In fact, he married the mother of Robert Estienne. Does he do an Aldine letter? Well, here it is. Not that much. Sure, A has a horizontal crossbar, but none of the other letters matches. That M and G are not there, and the lowercase g too is very unlike Griffo's, whereas Augereau's is very close indeed, and so is Constantin's. But Garamond is the name everyone knows because it survived in the material sold by the Le Bay foundry, and he's the only person of which we actually have a more or less contemporary image. The Le Bay memorandum is the source of our idea that he did his apprenticeship with Augereau, and then when he left his apprenticeship, he worked with master printers in Paris, presumably, and then set up by himself. Well, we'll have a look at his work. The first authenticated work of Garamond that we have is a Greek type in 3 sizes, and he clearly got the job through Etienne, but here is the so-called King's Roman, because it was in fact a royal command, and the model was the work of a calligrapher who was copying out texts in the Royal Library, a man called, well, his Latin version of his name was Vegetius. And if we look at the detail, here is the detail of the very, very complex calligraphy. There are many examples of ligatures of 2 and 3 characters put together. I won't go into the detail here, but this is clearly the work of a punch cutter who now knows how to do punch cutting, and whose name was worth recording. In the 1540s, he got into publishing very briefly, and so here is an edition in French of a Greek historian, Thucydides, and from the imprint at the bottom, you see the date 1545, and he was in partnership with a man called Jean Barbet, and then you have the name Claude Garamond, which incidentally shows that when it was left to him, that's the way he spelt it. One of the most interesting documents of the work of Garamond is in fact produced in Frankfurt am Main. This is one of these extraordinary survivals, a big 48 by 31 centimetre broadside, probably made for pinning up at the Frankfurt Book Fair because it shows Roman type. The same foundry, Berner, Konrad Berner, also produced German type for the German market. But here we have this extraordinary specimen, so-called specimen characterum, a specimen of type. And here I'm showing it to you directly from the original. The only published facsimile available in print is not from this original broadside, which was thought in the 1960s to have been destroyed in the Second World War. Well, it wasn't. It's in the University Library in Frankfurt am Main, and that's where I made these images. I don't know another published version of this specimen that's frankly worth looking at. So here, if you look on the right-hand side, this is a canon type, canon de Garamond. Below it is a petit canon de Garamond. So quite a lot of these Romans on this sheet, in fact almost all of them, are attributed to Garamond. Don't take it too literally. The petit canon, we now are pretty certain, is actually by Robert Grandjean. But the top one certainly is the work of Garamond. And lower down the sheet, two more of them. A parangon, that was a size, having measured it here from the original, I can tell you it's 19 point. And the great virtue is this is clearly brand new type, newly cast. In fact, we can look at a close-up. So there is a newly cast type by Claude Garamond. It's one of the latest of his types, probably or certainly cut in the last decade of his life, before he died in 1561. It's maybe slightly familiar for a reason I'll explain. Here it is in Germany. Here it is in Antwerp, because the Lebet family, having the original punches, sold matrices of it to Plantin in Antwerp, and this is the specimen that was used for the model for the Adobe digital Garamond, not least because it gives a full character set, and indeed all the numerals too, which is very convenient for Robert Slimbach, who made the Adobe version. Well, we can look in the Plantin collection for other examples too. Here, for example, is the 17 point, the Gros Romain, from the specimen sent by Lebet to Plantin, and backed up, if we turn it round, it's a letter which in France is called Gros Romain, cut by Claude Garamond, with the D ending that the Lebets put on the name. Well, there we are. Here's a 12 point, and you'll recognize, I'm sure, this is a kind of normal form of Roman. If you know French books, not only in the 16th century, but in the 17th, and in the 18th it was still being cast and used from original matrices. So a major influence on overall type design. We'll finish with a couple of examples. Here is that Gros Canon that was on the Berner sheet, but here it is in Paris, in the first book printed at the so-called Royal Printing House, Imprimerie Royale, a folio with a splendid Roman, splendid italic too, by the way, by Robert Grandjean. But if we go on with the Roman, here is a detail of the cutting of that type, which is clearly one of the very major achievements of Claude Garamond. I'm going to finish with a kind of imitation of Garamond. This is a big type, 65 point, made by Lebet, the type founder, but clearly following the design we've just looked at, perhaps a little bit bolder, but a very fine piece of cutting. So here is the Garamond style being made by the founder who would carry the tradition on. It's a type called double canon, cut by my late father, says young Lebet, who sold or tried to sell the design to Plantin, and it was Plantin who has the specimen in the Plantin-Moretus Museum in Antwerp today.